In the dawn hours of August 15th, 1944, when church bells echoed through narrow cobblestone streets announcing liberation, the small village of Saint-Mer in Normandy prepared for a different kind of ceremony. Marie-Claire Dubois, 26 years old and daughter of the local pharmacist, found a crude black cross painted on her door, a mark that transformed her from neighbor to traitor overnight. The crowd gathered silently at first, then with growing murmurs as the cold morning air carried the scent of cheap wine and something sharper, retribution. Henri Lambert, 42 years old, raised his camera as the square filled with villagers, capturing what would become the most brutal public ritual this community had witnessed since the Middle Ages. Women dragged from their homes, stripped of dignity before being stripped of hair, their screams mingling with cheers from people who had eaten at their tables only months before. This is the story of how 4 years of occupation transformed ordinary citizens into judges, executioners, and silent witnesses. Subscribe now to discover which collaborators escaped punishment and what a forgotten archive revealed 50 years later. The autumn rain fell in a steady patter against the window panes of the town hall, casting long shadows across the wooden floor of what had once been a classroom. Now, on October 23rd, 1944, it served as the meeting place for what the residents of Saint-Mer had taken to calling the Committee of Public Safety, a name borrowed from Revolution days that carried with it a weight of historical terror few acknowledged openly. 8 men sat around a table that seemed too small for the purpose, their faces illuminated by yellow lamplight that did little to penetrate the gloom. The list stands at 27 names, said Albert Moreau, the newly appointed mayor who had spent the occupation years as a passive observer, neither collaborating nor resisting. He shuffled papers with hands that bore the calluses of his former profession as a carpenter, a trade he had abandoned when opportunity presented itself after liberation. 27 women who have been identified as having had relations with German soldiers. And the evidence? Asked Dr. Pierre Fournier, 61 years old with silver hair and the only person at the table who had also served during the previous war. His expression remained carefully neutral, though his eyes betrayed a wariness that came from seeing too much suffering to believe in simple narratives of justice. We have testimony, Albert replied, tapping the stack of papers before him. Neighbors who observed German officers entering homes at night, reports of gifts, chocolate, stockings, meat when none could be found in village shops. Multiple witnesses for each case. Witnesses who might have their own reasons for accusations, Pierre noted quietly. Property disputes from before the war, personal grudges, envy. Are you defending them? Georges Laurent asked sharply. At 34 years old, he had transformed himself from a schoolteacher into the most vocal member of the committee, his thin face flushed with the fervor of someone who had discovered purpose in punishment. These women spread their legs for the enemy while our men died in prison camps or fought with the resistance in the forest. They ate well while children starved. Pierre sighed, removing his glasses to clean them with a handkerchief. I am suggesting only that we proceed with care, that we remember justice requires evidence beyond rumor, that we consider what 4 years of occupation means for young women left alone, pressured, sometimes threatened. The evidence is sufficient, Albert declared, ending the debate with the authority his position granted him. The question before us now is the form punishment should take. The men looked at one another, faces grave in the lamplight. Georges was the first to speak, his voice steady and resolute. Public shaming, he said. As was done in Cherbourg and Caen, the head shaved, a swastika painted on the forehead, paraded through town so everyone can see. It is less than they deserve, but it marks them, makes their betrayal visible. And then? Pierre asked. Exile, Albert answered. And after the ceremony, they leave Saint-Mer. Where they go is not our concern. And their property? Confiscated for the public good, Georges said immediately, to help those who suffered under occupation, those who resisted rather than collaborated. Pierre noted that Georges had already moved into the apartment above the former German headquarters, a space previously belonging to the widow Leclerc, whose name appeared on their list. He wondered how many other properties would change hands in the coming weeks, how much of this justice was tinged with opportunity. Very well, Albert said, scanning the faces around the table. All in favor of proceeding with the public ceremony on Sunday after church? 7 hands rose. Pierre kept his in his lap, but did not speak further. His silence was noted, but not remarked upon. It is decided then, Albert concluded. We will begin with the 5 most egregious cases. Marie-Claire Dubois, Simone Petit, Jean Rousseau, Élise Morel, and Claudette Brun. The others will follow in subsequent weeks. No one mentioned that these 5 women were also among the most attractive in the village, that their punishment would draw the largest crowds, or that their properties were the most desirable. Such considerations remained unspoken, but understood in the small room filled with the sound of rain and the scratch of a pen recording decisions made by men who had found themselves suddenly in positions of power after years of powerlessness. Marie-Claire Dubois sat alone in her bedroom, listening to the rain against the roof. She had not left the house in 3 days, not since finding the black cross, painted on her door and the word whore scrawled across her garden wall. Through the thin curtains, she could see a figure standing across the street, someone watching to ensure she did not flee before judgment could be rendered. She opened the drawer of her bedside table and removed a small leather journal, flipping through pages filled with her neat handwriting. Dates, names, observations recorded meticulously over 4 years of German occupation. She had begun keeping the journal in 1940, initially as a way to maintain sanity in a world turned upside down, later as something more purposeful: evidence. Her fingers traced an entry from July 1941. Mayor Richaud hosted dinner for Commandant Weber and 3 officers, provided local wine from his private cellar, discussed new regulations for curfew enforcement, agreed to identify communist sympathizers in exchange for increased rations for town hall staff. The former mayor had been among the first to reinvent himself after liberation, suddenly discovering a deep patriotism that had supposedly led him to subtle acts of resistance all along. No one questioned this transformation, perhaps because examining it too closely would require examining their own conduct during those 4 long years. Marie-Claire turned to more recent entries, pausing at one from March 1944. Lieutenant Hoffman provided information about planned deportations: 23 Jewish families to be rounded up next Tuesday, past warning through Marcel to resistance cell in Beaumont, families evacuated Sunday night. She closed the journal, wrapping it carefully in oilcloth before sliding it beneath a loose floorboard under her bed. They would come for her soon, but they would not find this, her true record of the occupation, so different from the story now being told throughout the village. Marie-Claire moved to the mirror, studying her reflection. Her dark hair fell past her shoulders, thick and wavy, hair that had drawn compliments since childhood, hair that would soon be shorn to her scalp as a mark of shame. Her face was pale with shadows beneath her eyes, but her gaze remained steady. 26 years old, and already her life in this village was over. She had made her choices knowing this might happen. Lieutenant Karl Hoffman had been assigned to billet in her home in 1941, a quiet, bookish man who spoke perfect French and quoted Voltaire. Their arrangement had begun as a cold necessity. A German officer in her house meant protection from the worst depredations of occupation. It became something else over time, something neither of them had anticipated. Not love exactly, but understanding. Connection in a time when connections were dangerous. What the villagers saw was a German officer entering and leaving her home, bringing occasional gifts, small luxuries in a time of desperate shortages. What they did not see were the messages passed, the warnings delivered, the small acts of sabotage coordinated. They did not know that Karl Hoffman had been part of the German resistance, one of the officers who opposed Hitler from within, who used his position to save lives when possible. He had been transferred east in early 1944, before liberation. She had not heard from him since, and assumed he was dead, like so many others. His last words to her had been a warning. When this ends, they will look for scapegoats. They will not want complicated truths. Be ready. She had been ready, or thought she was. She had her journal, her evidence, her truth. But as liberation euphoria hardened into something colder, she realized that evidence and truth might not matter against the narrative already forming. The simple story of collaboration and betrayal that allowed the village to avoid confronting its own complex history of accommodation, compromise, and survival. A sharp knock at the front door startled her from these thoughts. Marie-Claire took a deep breath, smoothing her dress with trembling hands. They were early. The ceremony was not scheduled until Sunday after church, but perhaps they had decided to begin the process of arrest before then. She descended the stairs slowly, each step feeling like a final countdown. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. Marie-Claire opened the door to find not the committee member she expected, but Dr. Fournier standing alone in the rain, water dripping from his hat brim. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. "There are matters we should discuss." Marie-Claire stepped aside, allowing him to enter. She had known Pierre Fournier her entire life. He had delivered her, treated her childhood illnesses, employed her briefly as a nurse before the war. His presence now, alone, seemed both a kindness and a confirmation that what was coming could not be avoided. "They have made their decision," she said, leading him into the small sitting room. No need to elaborate on who they were. "Yes," he confirmed, removing his wet hat but declining to sit. "Sunday after Mass. You and 4 others to begin. More in the weeks that follow." Marie-Claire nodded, her face composed despite the churning in her stomach. "And you have come to warn me? Or to suggest I flee?" Fleeing would only confirm guilt in their eyes. Pierre said, his voice low as though he feared being overheard even here. And they are watching the roads. But I came because I believe there is more to your story than what is being told in committee meetings. She studied his face, looking for the trap. Finding none, she asked, "What makes you think that?" "Because I knew Karl Hoffman," he said simply. "We met before the war at a medical conference in Paris. He contacted me in 1942. We worked together on several occasions." Marie-Claire felt her careful composure crack slightly. "He never told me." "Compartmentalization," Pierre explained. "The safest way to operate. He told me only that he had another contact in the village, someone he trusted implicitly. I suspected it might be you, based on where he was billeted, but confirmation would have endangered us all." "And now?" she asked, hope flaring briefly before reality extinguished it. "Will you tell the committee?" Pierre's expression answered before his words did. "They do not want to hear it. The narrative is established. Collaborator. Horizontal collaboration specifically. The evidence of your relationship with a German officer is public knowledge. The nature of that relationship, its purpose, the lives saved, those complications are inconvenient to the story Sainte-Mère is telling itself now. So I am to be punished to maintain a convenient fiction?" "Yes," he said simply, "though I have argued for moderation where possible." Marie-Claire laughed bitterly. "Moderation in public humiliation? Perhaps they will use sharper scissors on others." Pierre did not smile. "I have come to warn you that Georges Laurent is particularly focused on your case. He has claimed your house as his right once confiscation occurs. He has also suggested that mere head shaving might be insufficient punishment for someone of your prominence in the community. What does that mean?" "It means the ceremony may involve additional elements, stripping, marking." He could not meet her eyes as he spoke. "I tell you this so you can prepare yourself mentally, so you are not taken by surprise." Marie-Claire felt a coldness spread through her chest. She had seen photographs smuggled from other liberated towns, had heard rumors of what happened to women accused of collaboration. But somehow she had not fully believed it would happen here, in Sainte-Mère, where she had lived her entire life, where these people had known her since childhood. "Thank you for the warning," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Is there anything else?" Pierre hesitated, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a small glass vial. "Sedative," he explained, placing it on the side table. "If you wish to be less present during what comes, a small mercy I can offer." Marie-Claire stared at the vial, understanding the kindness behind the gesture, but knowing she would not use it. "I will face it conscious," she said. "I have nothing to be ashamed of, whatever they may believe." "As you wish." Pierre moved toward the door, then paused. "Your father was my friend. He would be proud of your courage." "My father died believing I had betrayed everything he taught me," she replied. "That is part of the price I paid." "Perhaps not," Pierre said softly. "He spoke to me near the end. He had his suspicions about your true activities. He understood more than you know." Before she could respond to this revelation, he was gone, slipping back into the rainy evening, leaving Marie-Claire alone with the small vial of escape she would not take and the knowledge that Sunday would arrive, regardless of what truths might exist beyond the simple narrative of betrayal and punishment. Sunday dawned clear and cold, the rain of previous days giving way to harsh autumn sunlight that offered illumination without warmth. Marie-Claire woke early, though she had barely slept. She bathed meticulously, washing her hair with the last of her lavender soap, an act of defiance against what was to come. She dressed with care in her best blue dress, applied a touch of lipstick saved from before the war, and pinned her mother's cameo brooch to her collar. If they intended to strip her of dignity, she would present herself with as much as possible to begin. If they meant to transform her into a spectacle, she would ensure the image captured was one of composure rather than defeat. They could take her hair, perhaps her clothes, but they could not take her sense of self unless she surrendered it first. The church bells began to ring at 9 o'clock, calling the faithful to Mass. Marie-Claire remained in her home, waiting. They would come after the service, when the congregation was properly fortified with scripture and communion, their actions blessed in advance by Père Thomas, who had managed the remarkable feat of maintaining good relations with the German commanders, while secretly hearing confession from resistance members. At 10:30, she heard them coming, not the committee members alone, but what sounded like a crowd moving through the street, voices raised in anticipation. Marie-Claire took a final look around the house where she had grown up, where she had nursed her father through his final illness, where she had made decisions that seemed right and necessary in a time of impossible choices. Then she straightened her shoulders and opened the door before they could knock. Albert Moreau stood at the front, flanked by Georges Laurent and 3 other committee members. Behind them stretched what appeared to be most of the village, faces both familiar and suddenly strange in their expectation. Marie-Claire saw neighbors she had known all her life, women who had exchanged recipes with her mother, men who had bought medicines from her father's shop, children too, brought to witness justice or perhaps to learn the price of transgression. Marie-Claire Dubois, Albert announced formally, as though she might not recognize her own name, you have been found guilty of criminal collaboration with the enemy through intimate relations with occupying forces. You are sentenced to public punishment and permanent exile from Saint-Mer. No trial. No opportunity to speak in her own defense. No mention of evidence beyond the assumed intimacy with a German officer. The justice of liberation, swift and unencumbered by procedure. Do you understand the sentence? Albert asked, when she remained silent. I understand what you're doing, Marie-Claire replied, her voice carrying clearly to the crowd. Whether it is justice is another question entirely. A murmur ran through the onlookers. George stepped forward, his face flushing with anger at this hint of defiance. Bring her, he ordered, and two men moved to grasp her arms. Marie-Claire shook them off. I can walk on my own. She stepped out of her house and into the street, forcing herself to look directly at the faces surrounding her. Some dropped their gaze, unable to meet her eyes. Others stared back with righteous anger or excitement poorly disguised as moral outrage. A few, very few, showed something that might have been doubt or regret. They led her to the town square, where a chair had been placed on a wooden platform hastily constructed for the occasion. As they approached, Marie-Claire saw that she was not to be the only one punished that day. 4 other women were already there, guarded by committee members. Simone Petit, who had worked as a translator for the German headquarters, Jean Rousseau, whose crime had been accepting gifts from an officer who frequented her café, Elise Morel, a widow whose house had been requisitioned for German staff, and Claudette Brun, barely 19, who had fallen in love unwisely and too publicly. Their eyes met in silent recognition, not quite solidarity, for each had made different choices for different reasons, but acknowledgement of their shared position as necessary sacrifices to the village's need for catharsis. The crowd formed a circle around the platform, pressing close, their collective breath visible in the cold air. Marie-Claire was led up the wooden steps and forced into the chair at the center. Someone tied her hands behind her back, the rope cutting into her wrists. Marie-Claire Dubois, Georges announced, assuming the role of master of ceremonies with evident satisfaction, you have consorted with the enemy, betrayed your community, and dishonored the memory of those who resisted occupation. Your punishment will serve as an example to all who might consider such treachery in the future. He produced a pair of scissors, holding them up so they caught the sunlight. The crowd grew quiet, anticipation replacing the earlier murmurs. Do you have anything to say before sentence is carried out? He asked, a performative gesture of fairness. Marie-Claire looked out at the sea of faces, people who had known her all her life now transformed into spectators, eager for her humiliation. She saw Dr. Fournier near the back, his expression grim. Near him stood Marcel Lefebvre, the baker who had carried messages for her to the resistance, now silent rather than stepping forward to speak the truth. She could not blame him. To defend her now would only mark him as the next target. She could tell them about the warnings passed, the lives saved, the risks taken. She could name the village collaborators who had grown rich, supplying German officers, while maintaining spotless public reputations. She could expose the hypocrisy of men now wearing armbands of the provisional government who had clinked glasses with Commandant Weber only months before. But what would it achieve? Her word against the narrative already established, a condemned woman's desperate attempts to spread blame rather than accept punishment. And perhaps, most crucially, it would endanger those who had truly resisted, whose secrets she still kept. I have nothing to say to this audience, she finally answered. History will render its own verdict in time. Georges' mouth tightened at this response. He moved behind her and grasped a handful of her dark hair, pulling it taut. Begin, he ordered, and the scissors closed with a metallic snap. The first lock of hair fell to the platform, then another, and another. Georges worked methodically, his movements becoming rougher as he progressed, sometimes pulling hard enough to make Marie-Claire wince despite her determination to show no reaction. The crowd watched in silence at first, then began to call out. Most voices encouraged the punishment. Cut it all! Show her head. Traitor! While a few remained silent, bearing witness without participation. When her hair had been reduced to ragged patches, Georges set aside the scissors and produced an electric razor that hummed to life. This was new technology for many in the village, brought specifically for this purpose. The symbolism was not lost on Marie-Claire. German efficiency repurposed for punishment of those associated with Germans. The razor moved across her scalp, removing the remaining hair, the vibration against her skin a strange intimacy in this public spectacle. Marie-Claire fixed her gaze on a point above the crowd, refusing to close her eyes, refusing to give them the satisfaction of her tears. When her head had been completely shaved, Georges stepped back to admire his work, then turned to the crowd. Behold the traitor exposed, he called out, and a ragged cheer rose from many throats. Marie-Claire had thought this would be the extent of her punishment: humiliation, hair-shorn, public disgrace. But Georges was not finished. He turned to someone in the crowd who handed him a brush and a can of black paint. "That her shame may be visible to all," he announced, "we mark her as what she is." The brush, cold and wet, moved across her forehead. Marie-Claire could not see what he painted, but she could guess: a swastika, the ultimate symbol of association with the enemy. She heard gasps from the crowd, saw some people turn away, unwilling to watch this final degradation. When he finished, Georges stepped back again, surveying his work with evident satisfaction. He then grasped the front of her dress and tore it open, exposing her undergarments to the crowd. "See how she dressed for German officers," he called out. "Fine silk when honest French women wore rags." The undergarments were cotton, not silk, mended many times, like everything else during occupation, but truth had ceased to matter. This was theater now, ritual humiliation requiring specific elements to satisfy the crowd's expectations. Some shouted approval at this escalation, others looked uncomfortable, the reality of what they were witnessing perhaps different from what they had imagined. Dr. Fournier had turned away entirely, unable to watch. Marie-Claire felt a curious detachment, as though observing a scene in which someone else sat exposed and humiliated. Georges reached for her dress again, clearly intending to remove it completely, when a voice cut through the crowd's noise. "Enough!" Heads turned to see who had spoken. Albert Moreau stepped onto the platform, his expression unreadable. "The sentence was head shaving and marking," he said quietly to Georges. "Not stripping. We are not barbarians." Georges looked mutinous, but after a moment stepped back. Albert untied Marie-Claire's hands and helped her to her feet. Her legs trembled, but she forced them to support her. "Walk," Albert instructed, his voice lower, "through the crowd and out of the village. A car waits at the north road to take you to the train station. Do not return to Saint-Mer." Marie-Claire held the torn fragments of her dress together as best she could. With as much dignity as the situation allowed, she descended from the platform and began walking through the path that opened reluctantly in the crowd. The faces blurred around her. Some spat at her feet. Others called out insults. A few looked away, shame or regret in their averted eyes. Marie-Claire kept walking, one foot in front of the other, her newly exposed scalp cold in the autumn air, the paint on her forehead still wet and dripping. As she reached the edge of the square, she heard the proceedings continue behind her. Simone Petit was being led to the chair now, her terror visible in her rigid posture. The cycle would repeat 4 more times today, and then again in the weeks to come, until all 27 women on the list had been purged from Saint-Mer's collective body. Marie-Claire did not look back. She walked through streets she had known all her life, past the pharmacy her father had owned, past the school she had attended, past neighbors who quickly closed their doors and shutters rather than acknowledge her passage. At the North Road, as promised, a car waited, a black Citroën with Henri Lambert behind the wheel. The photographer who had documented the ceremony now offered silent transport to exile. Marie-Claire hesitated, then got in. She had no alternatives. "Where are you taking me?" she asked as he started the engine. "Train station at Beaumont," Henri replied, not looking at her. "From there, wherever you choose to go." They drove in silence for several minutes, the village receding behind them. When they were well away from Saint-Mer, Henri spoke again. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his jacket and withdrawing an envelope. "From Dr. Fournier." Marie-Claire took it with numb fingers. Inside, she found money, enough for a train ticket and perhaps a few weeks of subsistence, along with a folded note. She opened it to find Pierre's meticulous handwriting. "I have retrieved your journal from beneath the floorboard. It will be kept safe until such time as truth becomes more valuable than comfortable narratives. The photographs I took today will also be preserved, not as celebration of justice, but as documentation of injustice. What was done to you and others was not justice, but vengeance, seeking simple targets. May you find peace beyond Saint-Mer. There are others who know the real work you did. Find them in Paris if you can. Marcel has contacts who can help. With deepest regret for my insufficient courage, Pierre Fournier." Marie-Claire refolded the note carefully, tucking it back into the envelope. She looked out the window at the Norman countryside passing by, fields and hedgerows, farms and distant church spires, a landscape that had endured centuries of wars and occupations and liberations, each bringing its own version of justice and injustice. "You were there," she said to Henri. "You took pictures?" "Yes," he acknowledged. "It is my job to document." "And do you believe what they say about us? About me?" Henri was silent for a long moment, his eyes on the road. Finally, he said, "I documented many things during occupation: German officers entering homes, village officials dining with enemy commanders, goods changing hands, adjustments made to survive. Everyone collaborated in some way. Some are punished, others reinvent themselves as heroes. The camera sees but cannot judge intentions. Yet you participated today. I documented, he corrected. Every image captured tells a story, though not always the story the subjects believe they are telling. Marie Claire touched her shaved head, feeling the unfamiliar contours of her scalp, the tacky paint still marking her forehead. And what story do your photographs tell of today? That depends on who views them and when, Henri replied. Now, they show justice as Saint-Mère wishes to see it. Later, perhaps, they will show something else entirely. The camera does not lie, but time changes how we interpret what it captures. They reached the train station as afternoon shadows lengthened. Henri stopped the car but did not immediately unlock the doors. Before you go, he said, reaching into his camera bag, you should have this. He handed her a small paper envelope. Inside, Marie Claire found a single photograph, herself as she had been before, hair intact, expression serious but composed. A portrait Henri had taken months earlier for identity documents. To remember, he explained simply. Marie Claire studied the image, a woman who no longer existed in the form captured on paper. Thank you, she said, tucking it into the envelope with the money and Pierre's note. Henri nodded once, then unlocked the doors. Good luck, Mademoiselle Dubois. She stepped out of the car into the late afternoon sunlight, clutching the envelope, her torn dress held closed with one hand. The few people at the rural station stared at her shorn head and marked forehead, quickly moving away as though collaboration might be contagious. Marie Claire straightened her shoulders and walked toward the ticket window. Behind her, she heard Henri's car pull away, returning to Saint-Mère and whatever ceremonies of purification remained. Ahead lay an uncertain future, exile from everything familiar, the need to rebuild an identity beyond the mark now branded on her skin and in the collective memory of her community. As she waited for the Paris train, Marie Claire touched the cameo brooch still pinned to her collar, the one piece of herself they had not taken, had perhaps not even noticed in their focus on more dramatic symbols. Her mother's voice seemed to whisper from it. Survive first, justice comes later, if at all. She had survived. She would continue to survive. And perhaps someday, when France had moved beyond the immediate need for scapegoats and simple narratives, when the complex truths of occupation could be examined with clearer eyes, she would return, not to Saint-Mère specifically, but to a country ready to confront the uncomfortable reality that collaboration and resistance were rarely absolute categories, but points on a spectrum along which most people moved as circumstances required. Until then, she had a train to catch and a new life to create, marked but not defined by what had occurred in a village square on a cold autumn morning in 1944. The train arrived with a screech of brakes and billowing steam. Marie Claire boarded with the few francs Dr. Fournier had provided, finding an empty compartment where she could avoid the stares of fellow passengers. As the train pulled away from the platform, she did not look back at the countryside receding behind her. Instead, she focused on the tracks ahead, leading toward a city where anonymity might provide a different kind of liberation, the freedom to be neither heroine nor traitor, but simply herself, with all the complicated truths that entailed. In the years that followed, the women punished in villages and towns across liberated France carried their shaved heads and marked foreheads like badges of a particular kind of service, not to the German occupiers as their communities believed, but to the complicated reality of survival in wartime. Some, like Marie Claire, had engaged in actual resistance while maintaining the appearance of collaboration. Others had simply done what was necessary to feed their children, protect their families, or avoid deportation. A few had genuinely sympathized with the occupiers, or found connection across enemy lines. Most existed somewhere in the messy middle, making choices day by day without the luxury of knowing which side would ultimately prevail. The photographs taken in town squares across France in 1944 became historical documents, evidence not of justice served, but of communities processing trauma through ritual humiliation of those least able to defend themselves. The shaved heads grew back. The painted swastikas faded. The torn dresses were mended or replaced. But the memory remained, passed down through generations, a reminder of how quickly justice could become vengeance when fear and shame demanded targets. In Paris, Marie Claire found herself among thousands of displaced women bearing the same marks of punishment. They recognized one another instantly on streets and in marketplaces. The particular way a scarf was tied to cover a still-growing scalp, the haunted look that came from public humiliation, the careful way they moved through crowds avoiding attention. These women formed informal networks of support, sharing information about employers who would not ask questions, landlords who would rent rooms without references, doctors who would treat them without judgment. They met in cafes on the left bank, these marked women, speaking in low voices about what had happened in villages and towns across France. Some carried genuine guilt for choices made during occupation. Others carried rage at unjust accusations. Most carried a complex mixture of emotions that defied simple categorization. They compared stories of their ceremonies, noting the similarities, the scissors, the jeers, the men who had enthusiastically assumed roles as judges despite their own compromised histories during occupation. In Bordeaux, they stripped us completely, said a woman named Renee, her hands trembling slightly as she lit a cigarette. Made us walk through town naked, even the elderly women. Then they painted our bodies with swastikas before allowing us to dress in rags. In Lyon, they bound our hands to posts in the market square, added another, who called herself only Matilda now, having abandoned her former identity entirely. Left us there for 24 hours while people spat and threw garbage. A woman died, heart failure from the strain and humiliation. The local newspaper reported it as justice served. Marie Claire listened to these stories, adding her own, each woman's experience becoming part of a larger tapestry of post-liberation vengeance that targeted those with the least power to resist or redefine the narrative. They began collecting these accounts, writing them down, creating an alternate historical record to counter the officially sanctioned version in which such punishments were presented as necessary cleansing of national honor. A professor from the Sorbonne, herself untouched by such ceremonies but troubled by their implications, helped organize these testimonies into a private archive. History is written by the victors, she told the women, but alternative histories survive in shadows, waiting for the moment when society is ready to confront uncomfortable truths. Your stories will have their time. That time was far distant in 1945. France was rebuilding, physically and psychologically, constructing a national mythology of widespread resistance and limited collaboration that allowed for collective healing at the expense of historical accuracy. The women with shaved heads represented inconvenient complications to this narrative, living reminders that occupation had forced impossible choices, that survival often required compromise, and that the line between resistance and collaboration was rarely as clear as post-war society wished to believe. Marie Claire's journal eventually found its way to a historical archive, one of many such documents that gradually shifted the narrative of occupation and liberation from simple binaries of heroism and betrayal toward a more nuanced understanding of human behavior under extreme pressure. The truth, when it finally emerged, was neither as heroic nor as villainous as the immediate post-liberation narrative suggested. Sainte-Mère continued its life as though the purge had cleansed it, as though the 27 women expelled from its midst had taken all collaboration with them into exile. Georges Laurent lived in Marie Claire's house until 1971, when a stroke took him, respected as a pillar of the community, his role in the post-liberation ceremonies remembered as necessary justice rather than opportunistic cruelty. Dr. Fournier continued his practice until retirement, carrying the knowledge of what had actually occurred during occupation, who had truly collaborated, who had truly resisted, and how most had done both as circumstances required. He never spoke publicly about Marie Claire Dubois or the others punished that autumn, but he kept their stories safe until historians were ready to hear them. Henri Lambert returned to Sainte-Mère after delivering Marie Claire to the train station, his camera bag lighter by one photograph but heavier with the weight of what he had witnessed and participated in documenting. As he drove through the countryside, he remembered other photographs taken during 4 years of occupation, images never developed, exposures deliberately ruined to protect those captured in the frame. Henri had not been a member of the resistance in any formal sense. He had never carried messages or weapons, never sabotaged German equipment or assassinated collaborators. His resistance had been quieter, more personal. The photographs not taken, the German officers who requested portraits and received subtly unflattering images, the identity pictures created for those who needed new documents with different names. His camera had witnessed the full spectrum of behavior during occupation. He had seen the mayor drinking cognac with German officers while discussing new regulations. He had seen shopkeepers setting aside best cuts of meat for Wehrmacht officers, while village children grew thin. He had seen the comfortable accommodations made by those now leading the ceremonies of punishment. He had also seen Marie Claire Dubois leaving her house at odd hours during curfew, carrying packages that might have been medicine or information or contraband. He had seen Lieutenant Hoffman speaking urgently with Dr. Fournier in the shadows behind the church. He had observed the small acts of defiance and resistance that occurred alongside the necessary compromises of survival. The camera captured truth, but deciding which truths to preserve and which to conceal had been Henri's private resistance during occupation. Now, in liberation, he continued that resistance by documenting not just the ceremonies of punishment, but the hypocrisy that surrounded them, the newly declared patriots who had been most accommodating to German authority, the sudden wealth of committee members who acquired properties confiscated from the punished women, the selective memory that allowed communities to project all collaboration onto convenient scapegoats while absolving themselves. When he returned to Sainte-Mère that evening, the celebrations were continuing. Jean Rousseau and Élise Morel had been processed while he was driving Marie Claire to the station. Claudette Brun was currently in the chair, sobbing openly as her blonde curls fell to the platform, her youth and beauty making the spectacle particularly satisfying to the crowd. Georges Laurent presided with the same enthusiasm he had shown earlier. perhaps even greater now that alcohol had flowed freely throughout the day. Henri raised his camera and documented it all, not just the shaving and marking, but the expressions on the faces surrounding the platform, the excitement in some eyes that went beyond righteous satisfaction into something darker, the discomfort on other faces, quickly hidden when they noticed his camera pointed their way, the casual cruelty of children imitating adults by throwing small stones or rotten fruit at the women as they were led away. He photographed Albert Moreau accepting congratulations for the well-run ceremony, smiling broadly, his resistance credentials established through organization of punishment rather than any action taken during actual occupation. He captured Pierre Fournier standing apart from the crowd, his expression unreadable, but his separation from the proceedings clear. He documented the men who had been assigned to inventory Marie Claire's house, already carrying out items before her property was officially confiscated, small thefts obscured within larger official seizure. These photographs would not appear in any official record of liberation. They would not be published in newspapers celebrating France's return to self-governance. Henri developed them privately, adding them to an archive maintained in a false wall of his studio. Images that complicated the narrative, that revealed the messy reality beneath the clarifying myth of swift justice. Years later, when researchers began seeking more nuanced accounts of liberation and occupation, Henri's photographs would provide visual evidence that supported the testimonies collected by women like Marie Claire in Paris. They would show not heroes and villains, clearly delineated, but human beings responding to extraordinary circumstances with a complex mixture of courage, cowardice, principle, and self-preservation, sometimes all embodied in the same individual depending on the moment and what was at stake. On November 12th, 1944, Marie Claire stood in a narrow attic room in Paris, watching her breath cloud in the cold air. The room contained only a sagging iron bed, a small table, and a chair with one broken leg propped against the wall. The landlady, Madame Villon, had asked no questions beyond whether Marie Claire could pay the first week's rent in advance. She had not commented on the scarf wrapped tightly around Marie Claire's head, nor on the fading mark still visible on her forehead. "Bathroom is shared, end of the hall," she had said, handing over a key attached to a wooden tag. "No visitors after 8, no cooking in rooms, no exceptions." It was the 5th place Marie Claire had inquired about, the first 4 turning her away with expressions ranging from suspicion to disgust. The money from Dr. Fournier had dwindled quickly. She had enough for perhaps 2 more weeks of rent and minimal food. After that, she would need work. Finding employment proved nearly impossible for women bearing the visible marks of punishment. Shop owners shook their heads before Marie Claire could even state her qualifications. Office managers claimed positions had just been filled. Restaurant proprietors looked pointedly at her covered head and suggested she try elsewhere. The few positions available to les tondeuses, the shorn ones, as they were called, involved night cleaning, factory work in distant districts, or propositions that had nothing to do with legitimate employment. Marie Claire refused to surrender to despair. She had survived occupation, had maintained dignity through public humiliation, had built a new life from nothing once before when her father died and left the pharmacy burdened with debts. She would do it again. She pulled from her small suitcase the journal she had begun keeping after arriving in Paris, not the detailed record of occupation she had maintained in Saint-Mer, but a new account documenting life after punishment. She wrote by candlelight, conserving electricity, recording her observations of post-liberation Paris with the same clinical precision she had once applied to documenting collaborators in her village. November 12th, she wrote, saw 3 women with shaved heads at Les Halles market today. One appeared to be in her 60s, walking with difficulty, supported by a younger woman also bearing marks of punishment. They were denied purchase at 2 vegetable stalls. The 3rd woman was selling handmade baby clothes from a blanket spread on the ground. No one would touch her goods. When I approached, she looked at my scarf and whispered, "Châtillon village." I nodded and purchased a small knitted cap, though I have no use for it. 20 francs better in her hands than mine. I insist. Marie Claire had discovered that women who had undergone similar ceremonies recognized one another instantly, even when headscarves concealed the most obvious evidence. Something in their posture, in their watchful eyes, in the careful way they navigated public spaces. Signals invisible to others, but immediately apparent to those who shared the experience. She continued writing. Met with Suzanne from Dijon and Claudine from Caen at Café Madeleine. Suzanne has found work as night cleaner at Hôpital Saint-Antoine through Doctor, who treated her husband in 1939. Claudine suggests I try the same, using nursing experience from before war. Says hospitals are desperate and less concerned with appearances than retail establishments. Will inquire tomorrow. Claudine also reports meeting American journalists interested in stories of horizontal collaborators, as they call us. Advised her to be cautious. Americans view Europe as theater for simple moral narratives, heroes and villains clearly defined. Our experiences defy such categorization. Marie Claire closed her journal as church bells marked 7 o'clock. She had begun collecting these accounts, not just her own experiences, but those of every punished woman she encountered, creating a counter-narrative to the official history already solidifying around liberation. These women's stories revealed patterns that complicated the simple tale of traitors receiving just punishment. Many, like herself, had engaged in various forms of resistance while maintaining appearances of cooperation with occupying forces. Others had made choices driven by hunger, by threats to family members, by the impossible calculus of survival under occupation. Some had formed genuine emotional connections across enemy lines, love or affection that transcended political divisions. A few admitted ideological sympathy with German authorities, believing promises of European unity or protection from communist influence. What united them was not the nature of their alleged crimes, but their vulnerability to punishment. Most were young, unmarried or widowed, without male protectors, without wealth or social position that might shield them from community vengeance. The village notary who had processed paperwork for German authorities continued his practice untroubled. The businessman who had secured contracts supplying German units now secured contracts for reconstruction. The mayor, who had enforced occupation regulations, now enforced liberation ordinances with equal enthusiasm. Only those without power to shape the narrative found themselves subjected to public ceremonies of purification, convenient vessels into which communities could pour their collective shame about accommodation and survival, allowing everyone else to emerge with resistance credentials retrospectively established. Marie Claire understood this with increasing clarity as she collected more stories, as patterns emerged across accounts from different regions. The knowledge did not lessen her anger, but transformed it from personal grievance to political understanding. What had happened in towns, squares across France, was not justice, but performance, rituals that allowed communities to symbolically cleanse themselves without confronting deeper questions about collective behavior under occupation. She lit the small stove in the corner of her room, using precious coal purchased with dwindling funds. As warmth gradually filled the space, Marie Claire unwound the scarf from her head, running her hand over the stubble now covering her scalp. 2 weeks since the ceremony, hair already beginning to return, soft and fine like a child's. In another month, it would cover the worst of the uneven patches left by Georges Laurent's enthusiastic scissors work. The physical marks would fade with time. The internal ones, the public humiliation, the exile from everything familiar, the knowledge of community betrayal, those would remain longer, perhaps permanently. But Marie Claire was discovering unexpected strength in shared experience, in the community of women forming around collected testimonies, in the work of documenting truth as counterweight to convenient fiction. Tomorrow, she would visit Hôpital Saint-Antoine, as Claudine suggested. She would present her qualifications without shame, would meet the gaze of whoever interviewed her directly, would neither hide her punishment nor allow it to define her. She would begin rebuilding, not just personal survival, but an alternative history that might eventually challenge the simplistic narrative already calcifying around occupation and liberation. Before sleeping, Marie Claire opened her journal once more and added a final line. We who were marked were meant to disappear, to carry away the collective shame of occupation, leaving communities with cleansed memories of universal resistance. Our continued presence, our testimonies, our refusal to accept the roles assigned to us in their purification rituals, these are acts of resistance more profound than any I undertook during actual occupation. They cannot exile truth, no matter how many women they exile from their villages. In the final analysis, the women with shaved heads served a purpose beyond their community's intent. They became living embodiments of war's moral complexity, of the impossible choices forced upon ordinary people in extraordinary times, and of the human tendency to seek simple explanations for situations that defy simplicity. Their punishment, meant to mark them as separate from their communities, ultimately bound them to the larger story of occupation and liberation that France would spend decades struggling to reconcile with its preferred image of itself. The truth, when it finally emerged through journals and photographs and oral histories collected decades later, was both better and worse than the narrative constructed in 1944. Better in that resistance had been more widespread than initially believed, operating in subtle ways through apparently collaborative relationships. Worse, in that genuine collaboration had reached much higher into community leadership than the public ceremonies of punishment had acknowledged, with those who had profited most from German occupation often leading the charge against convenient scapegoats. This complex truth arrived too late for the women who had borne the visible marks of their community's need for catharsis, but it ensured that their experiences became part of the historical record, not as collaborators, but as casualties of a particular kind of justice that serves power rather than truth. Their shaved heads grew back, but the photographs remained, testifying across decades to what happens when societies traumatized by occupation seek purification through ritual humiliation rather than genuine reckoning with collective complicity. That is the story the village squares witnessed in the autumn of 1944 not the punishment of traitors, but the sacrifice of scapegoats on the altar of convenient narratives. The truly guilty often held the scissors, directed the cameras, and claimed the spoils, while those marked as collaborators carried away the collective shame of communities desperate to begin again with clean consciences, regardless of what such cleansing actually cost. Marie-Claire Dubois understood this on that cold Sunday morning as the scissors cut away her hair, and with it her place in the community she had known all her life. She understood that her punishment was never truly about justice, but about narrative. The story Sainte-Mère needed to tell itself about occupation and resistance, heroism and betrayal. A story that required villains as clearly marked as her shaved head and painted forehead. The true story would emerge in time, carried in journals and photographs and memories preserved against the tide of convenient forgetting. Until then, the women with shaved heads would bear the visible weight of history's complexity, marked not by what they had actually done, but by what their communities needed them to represent. A simple answer to questions that had no simple answers. A clean line between resistance and collaboration when most lives were lived in the blurred space between. In that blurred space dwelled the actual truth of occupation, messy, contradictory, and human, waiting for a time when France could look directly at its reflection without requiring scapegoats to make the image more bearable. That time would come, eventually, though too late for Marie-Claire and the others who boarded trains to exile carrying the visible marks of their communities' inability to confront the more complicated truth that collaboration and resistance often wore the same face, depending on where one stood and what one needed to believe. It was not until 1970 that Dr. Pierre Fournier, now 87 years old and knowing his time was limited, contacted the French National Archives with an offer of documents preserved since liberation. The collection included Marie-Claire's original journal, meticulous records of German activities in Sainte-Mère, and a separate notebook documenting the post-liberation punishments with clinical precision, dates, names, methods, and those who had administered the ceremonies. Accompanying these papers were Henri Lambert's photographs, not just the public images of punishment ceremonies, but the hidden archive he had maintained, village officials dining with German officers, goods changing hands after curfew, the comfortable arrangements made throughout occupation by those who later led the charge against alleged collaborators. The archive director, a young historian named Jean-Michel Bouvier, recognized immediately the significance of these materials. These documents complicate our understanding of both occupation and liberation, he wrote in his initial assessment. Thus, they suggest that the clear demarcation between collaborator and resistor, so central to post-war French identity, was largely a retrospective construction, serving psychological and social needs rather than historical accuracy. The materials formed the foundation for a broader research initiative examining the gendered nature of post-liberation punishment, how ceremonies of purification focused overwhelmingly on women of limited social position, while men who had engaged in more substantial and profitable forms of collaboration often escaped consequences entirely. Researchers tracked the economic aftermath, documenting the transfer of property, businesses, and wealth from punished women to those who had organized the ceremonies. They mapped networks of power that reconstituted themselves after liberation with minimal disruption, despite changes in external authority. They interviewed surviving women who had experienced punishment, collecting testimonies that revealed patterns transcending individual communities. By 1975, scholars had identified more than 10,000 cases of women subjected to head shaving and public humiliation across France, a number that represented only documented incidents, with the actual total likely much higher. The majority of these women had been under 30 years old at the time of punishment. Most had been economically vulnerable, unmarried, widowed, or from working-class backgrounds. Few had held positions that allowed meaningful collaboration beyond personal relationships with German personnel. In contrast, documented cases of men punished for economic collaboration, selling goods or services to occupying forces, accepting contracts from German authorities, profiting from occupation, numbered fewer than 800 nationwide, despite evidence suggesting such activities were widespread and systemic. The emerging scholarly consensus confirmed what Marie-Claire and other punished women had understood in 1944. The ceremonies had been less about delivering justice to actual collaborators than about communities processing trauma through ritualized scapegoating of those with least power to resist designation as vessels for collective guilt. This academic reassessment occurred alongside broader societal changes in France. The generation that had experienced occupation as adults was aging. Younger citizens raised on heroic narratives of universal resistance were beginning to question simplified histories. The student movements of 1968 had challenged authority and conventional wisdom across all aspects of French society, including its carefully constructed post-war identity. By the early 1980s, public discussion of les femmes tendues, the shorn women, had shifted from unquestioned acceptance of their punishment as necessary justice to more critical examination of gendered violence and scapegoating mechanisms. Television documentaries featured interviews with surviving women, now in their 60s or 70s, speaking publicly about their experiences for the first time. Museum exhibitions presented photographs and documents from liberation alongside more complex contextual information about life under occupation. Marie-Claire Dubois did not live to see this shift in perspective fully manifest. She died in Paris in January 1983 after a brief illness, survived by her husband Marcel Lefebvre, the baker from Saint-Mer who had carried messages for the resistance and who had reconnected with Marie-Claire in Paris in 1950, and their two children, Jean and Sophie. At her funeral, attended by a small gathering that included several women who had shared the experience of punishment and exile, Marcel spoke of his wife's determination to preserve truth against convenient narratives. She understood that history is written not just by the powerful but by ordinary people who refuse to surrender their experiences to others' interpretations, he said. Her journals and testimony ensured that when France was finally ready to confront the full complexity of occupation and liberation, authentic voices would remain to challenge comfortable myths. After Marie-Claire's death, her children discovered among her possessions the complete archive she had maintained since 1944, not just her own journals, but collected testimonies from dozens of women across France who had experienced similar punishments. These materials, donated to the National Archives, provided further evidence for the scholarly reassessment already underway. They also found letters exchanged between Marie-Claire and Lieutenant Karl Hoffmann, preserved from destruction and carried into exile. The correspondence, continuing until 1947, revealed the German officer had survived the war, though wounded severely on the Eastern Front. His letters confirmed Marie-Claire's account of their relationship, not romantic collaboration, but strategic alliance between individuals who found themselves opposing their respective governments while trying to mitigate suffering where possible. History will eventually recognize that the lines drawn between collaborator and resistor were never as clear as post-war mythology required, he wrote in his final letter. Until then, we who lived in the gray spaces must carry the knowledge that human decency sometimes demanded actions that appeared as betrayal to those who prefer simple categories. By the turn of the 21st century, the academic reassessment had expanded into broader public consciousness. Documentaries, films, and novels explored the complex realities of occupation and the problematic nature of post-liberation punishment. Communities where ceremonies had occurred acknowledged this history through memorial plaques, museum exhibitions, and public discussions, no longer celebrating punishment as justice served, but recognizing it as a troubling response to collective trauma. In April 2004, the mayor of Saint-Mer, a woman named Élise Moreau, whose grandmother had been among those punished in 1944, unveiled a small monument in the town square where the ceremonies had occurred. The simple stone marker bore an inscription that would have been unimaginable decades earlier. In memory of those who suffered here in the name of justice, but in the service of simplification. May we remember that truth resists categories, that humanity encompasses contradiction, and that genuine reconciliation requires confronting complexity rather than creating convenient villains. Marie-Claire Dubois was mentioned by name, along with the other women punished in Saint-Mer during the autumn of 1944. Former neighbors who had witnessed or participated in the ceremonies attended alongside descendants of those punished, the community collectively acknowledging a history more nuanced than the narrative constructed in liberation's immediate aftermath. Henri Lambert's photographs were displayed in the town hall, no longer as documentation of justice served, but as evidence of justice perverted by the need for simple narratives in complex times. Dr. Fournier's preserved records revealed the full extent of actual collaboration within the community, economic transactions, social accommodations, survival strategies that had involved nearly every resident in some form of negotiation with occupying forces. The ceremony of acknowledgement and apology came too late for those directly affected. Marie-Claire, Simone, Jeanne, Élise, Claudette, all had died before this public reckoning occurred. But the reconsideration of their experiences, the reassessment of their punishment, and the recognition of scapegoating mechanisms that had transformed them from community members to embodiments of collective guilt represented a different kind of justice. The justice of historical truth finally acknowledged despite decades of convenient forgetting. Their story ultimately transcended the specific circumstances of occupation and liberation in France to illuminate broader patterns of how societies process trauma, how communities construct narratives that protect collective self-image, and how those with least power often bear the visible weight of history's complexity. The women with shaved heads became recognized not as collaborators who received deserved punishment, but as individuals caught in the machinery of symbolic purification, their bodies and identities sacrificed to facilitate national healing through simplification rather than honest reckoning. That recognition came gradually, painfully, and incompletely. much like the hair that began growing back even as Marie Claire boarded the train to Paris in 1944, carrying with her both the visible marks of punishment and the invisible determination to ensure that one day the full truth would emerge from beneath the convenient narratives constructed in liberation's aftermath.